In a world poised on the brink of apocalypse, one man dared to confront the inexorable forces of time itself. Armed only with his ship, the Relativity, Captain Eldridge set forth on a quest to alter the course of history and save humanity from extinction. Captain Eldridge sat alone on the bridge of the time cruiser Relativity, the gentle hum of the engines and beeps of the console his only company. He leaned forward, switching on the log recorder. Captain's log, stardate 5748.9. We are en route to Sector 001 in the year 2422 to attempt a maneuver of unprecedented consequence, he began, his voice gravelly with unease. If successful, we may be able to avert the extinction of the human race. If not, he trailed off, shoulders slumping. Visions of Earth's once vibrant cities, now vacant and crumbling, flickered through his mind. Billions dead, civilization collapsed, and the last hope for humanity's survival rested squarely on his shoulders. After a moment, he straightened and continued, If not, God help us all. He switched off the recorder and rubbed his temples, feeling the weight of the mission pressing down on him. As captain of the time cruiser Relativity, he had been entrusted with nothing less than the survival of mankind itself. Failure was not an option. The entire human race was depending on him to alter the course of history. A beep drew his attention back to the main view screen, where an image of a bespectacled man in a white lab coat blinked into focus. Dr. Morrow, I presume you're ready? Eldridge asked grimly. The scientist nodded, adjusting his glasses. The chronoton field is primed and ready for deployment, Captain. We can initiate the procedure on your command. His voice was calm, but his hands shook slightly as he checked the settings on the control panel before him. Excellent. Then if you'll meet me in the transporter room, we can begin. Eldridge stood slowly, smoothing the front of his uniform. His stomach churned with anxiety, though his face remained an impassive mask. He knew the odds, knew the terrible risks they were taking, but they had no choice. The plan had to work. He made his way briskly from the bridge, officers and technicians scrambling out of his path. As captain, he projected an air of calm control, hiding his doubts and fears behind a facade of steely confidence. Crewmen saluted as he passed, their faces pale but determined. Like him, they knew what was at stake today. Dr. Morrow stood waiting by the transporter pad, fiddling with his equipment when Eldridge arrived. He gave a nervous smile. Well, Captain, this is it, he began, voice trembling slightly. If my calculations are correct, we should be able to travel back to the mid-21st century and locate patient 0 before the outbreak occurs. Eldridge nodded. Then we'll be making history today, Doctor. For better or worse. He stepped onto the transporter pad, back straight and jaw tight. Let's just hope we can make history the way we intend to, he continued grimly. The timeline is fragile. The tiniest deviation could ripple through time and have catastrophic effects. Dr. Morrow gulped, his earlier confidence gone. Yes, of course. We'll need to take great care, he replied anxiously. Together they stood on the pad, technicians making the final adjustments around them. Eldridge gave the order, Energize. The familiar tingle of the transporter beam enveloped them. The ship blinked out of view, replaced by the swirling blue vortex of temporal space. Eldridge felt the push and pull of his atoms being disassembled and reassembled across the centuries. Strange creatures seemed to flit past in the azure mists. With a flash, the transporter released them. The bizarre visions receded as the blue gave way to trees and sunlight. Birds chirped brightly in the distance. Eldridge breathed deeply. The clean, fresh air told him they had arrived. Well, Doctor, welcome to the year 2045, he said, checking his tricorder to verify their coordinates. The timeline matched. So far, so good. We have 2 hours before the critical point when the plague begins its rapid spread across North America. Dr. Morrow nodded, scanning the surroundings with his equipment. No signs of trouble yet. But we'd best hurry, Captain. 2 hours isn't much time. Eldridge's face was grim. No, it isn't. And failure here would mean the end of everything. We cannot afford to waste a second. He gestured toward a pathway through the trees. The initial outbreak began approximately 2 miles north of our location. Let's move. The two men set off briskly, Eldridge taking point with phaser drawn while Dr. Morrow scanned for temporal anomalies. Around them, the park teemed with life. Children laughing as they played on the jungle gym, adults relaxing on blankets in the grass, enjoying the sunny summer day, all utterly oblivious to the apocalypse soon to be unleashed upon the world. Unless Eldridge could stop it. Failure was not an option. The future, the very existence of the human race depended on him now. He would not, could not, let them down. Not this time. Too many lives had already been lost. The nightmarish scenes from 24-22 flashed through his mind, stealing his resolve. He would rewrite history today, no matter the cost. The path wound through the trees ahead. Eldridge picked up the pace, Morrow hurrying behind. Time was ticking away, each wasted moment bringing humankind closer to extinction. Eldridge's heart pounded as he marched towards the date with destiny, towards a confrontation that would shape the fate of the world. Eldridge and Morrow hurried along the tree-lined path, a tense silence hanging between them. Only the chirping of birds and the sound of children playing in the distance permeated the warm summer air. To anyone passing by, they appeared as just two men out for a walk in the park on a sunny day, but both were keenly aware that they trod the razor's edge of history, any misstep spelling doom for humanity. After 15 minutes of brisk walking, Eldridge held up a hand, bringing them to a halt. He scanned the area with narrowed eyes. "We're close. Ground zero should be just ahead." Morrow nodded, tightening his grip on his equipment. This was the moment that would define the future, or end it entirely. They crept forward through the trees, Eldridge's phaser leading the way. Then, suddenly, the path opened up into a small clearing. Children shrieked with delight as they chased each other around a modest playground. Parents relaxed on benches nearby, watching them play. Eldridge's eyes locked onto one child in particular, a young boy, no more than 5 or 6, his cherubic face flushed from play. As Morrow scanned the boy with his equipment, his eyes went wide. "That's him. Patient 0. He turned to Eldridge, face pale. "If our intel is correct, any moment now that boy will come into contact with the virus that sparks the pandemic and eventual downfall of human civilization." Eldridge's jaw tightened, his phaser hand steady. "Then we do what we came here to do. We isolate that vector and eliminate the threat." Morrow looked uncertain. "Eliminate? But he's just a child. A child who will become the catalyst for Earth's destruction if we don't act now," Eldridge replied harshly. With practiced aim, he took careful aim at the boy, who was now climbing the steps of the slide's ladder, oblivious to the fate that hung over him. Eldridge's finger tightened on the trigger. One shot and the apocalyptic future that awaited humankind would be erased. He began to squeeze, when suddenly, a shimmer in the air beside him made them both turn. Before their shocked eyes, a rift in space-time opened. Through the haze, Eldridge glimpsed fantastic vistas, alien worlds and bizarre creatures. A strong force began to pull at them. "It's a temporal anomaly," Morrow shouted over the rising din. "Something's gone wrong." Eldridge shouted in surprise as the phaser was ripped from his grip, vanishing into the void. He grabbed at a tree, struggling for purchase as the rift's pull intensified. Beside him, Morrow lost his footing, crying out as he slid helplessly towards the shimmering portal. "No!" Eldridge lunged, managing to grab the scientist's arm, but the force was too strong. With a yell, Eldridge found himself being dragged along, They tumbled into the rift together, the park and playground blurring as they were sucked into the swirling madness. With a resonant boom, the anomaly sealed shut behind them. Eldridge and Morrow found themselves floating in an endless sea of stars and luminous nebulae. Strange alien constellations glittered around them. "Where are we?" Morrow gasped. Before Eldridge could respond, a deep, powerful voice echoed through the void. "You are in the nexus of infinity, an intersection of timelines and realities." Eldridge spun, searching for the source. "Show yourself!" Something began to coalesce before them, an androgynous humanoid form composed of pure energy. It regarded them with ageless, silver eyes. "I am the guardian of forever," it intoned. "You have tampered with energies beyond your comprehension. Your actions risked calamity untold." Eldridge stared back defiantly. "We risked nothing that wasn't already at stake. Without intervention, our timeline faced total annihilation." The Guardian seemed to contemplate this. "All existence depends on balance. In sparing your future, you would have destroyed an innocent life." It waved a hand, and scenes from the unchecked pandemic timeline played out before them. Cities burned, mankind driven to the edge of extinction. "Is this not the apocalypse you hoped to prevent?" the Guardian asked. Eldridge faltered. In his desperation to save humanity, he had nearly committed an atrocity against an unsuspecting child. Morrow laid a hand on his shoulder. "We wanted to help, but our methods were flawed," he said solemnly. Eldridge lowered his head, shame burning through him. In his arrogance, he had doomed everything. The Guardian spoke again, its voice oddly gentle. "Though your actions were rash, your intentions were just. Your fates and that of your world are not yet sealed." Eldridge looked up, hardly daring to hope. "Can you return us? Give us a chance to find another way?" The cosmic being nodded. "It is within my power. But know that the road ahead will not be easy. The forces you dare to contend with are ancient and capricious. Are you prepared?" Eldridge and Morrow exchanged a resolute look. Then Eldridge turned back to the Guardian. "We're ready. Send us back. We'll find a way to make this right." Morrow gripped his shoulder. "Whatever happens, whatever comes, we face it together." The Guardian raised its arms, energy rippling along its form. "So be it. May fortune guide you." Blinding light enveloped them. Eldridge felt himself being hurled across time and space once more. But now failure was not an option. The fate of the world depended on it. Eldridge materialized aboard the Relativity, stumbling slightly as the transporter beam released him. The familiar surroundings of the ship instantly comforted him after his harrowing ordeal. Morrow appeared on the pad beside him, steadying himself against the console. "Welcome back, gentlemen," the transport technician said. "We were starting to worry when we lost your signals." Eldridge nodded, still recovering his bearings. "Thank you, crewman. Dr. Morrow and I have much to discuss." They exited the transporter room in contemplative silence, each lost in their own thoughts. Eldridge's shoulders slumped under the weight of remorse and failure. His rash actions had doomed the very future he sought to save. As they entered the hallway, Eldridge turned to Morrow. "Doctor, convene the senior staff at once. We have a new mission, restoring the timeline." Morrow nodded gravely. "I'll gather them right away." Soon, the Relativity's main conference room was filled with the command staff, their faces etched with concern. Eldridge entered and took his place at the head of the table. "Thank you all for coming on such short notice," he began. "By now, you know our attempt to alter the past failed catastrophically, but we cannot lose hope. The Guardian has granted us a second chance, though the road ahead will be difficult." Morrow spoke up. "The critical factor is reestablishing the existence of Dr. Bertron, the scientist whose work was pivotal in developing the cure for the plague. Our actions accidentally erased him from the timeline." Eldridge nodded. Our task now is to navigate the tangled threads of history and reconstruct the major events of his life. We must become temporal detectives, piecing together clues and echoes to rebuild his narrative. The officers exchanged uneasy looks. One voiced the question on all their minds. Is such a thing even possible? It has to be, Eldridge said firmly. Billions of lives hang in the balance. Failure is not an option. He stood, authority radiating from him. Make no mistake, this will be the greatest challenge we have ever faced. The forces we contend with are mercurial. But we are no strangers to the impossible. If any crew in history can succeed, it is you. Eldridge eyed each of them in turn. I trust each of you with my life. Now I ask that you trust me. Trust that together, we can put right what went wrong. One by one, each officer nodded solemnly. The weight of humanity's future pressed down upon them, but Eldridge saw only iron resolve reflected back at him. Very well, he said. Let us begin. What followed were weeks of painstaking data analysis, tracking even the faintest historical traces of their missing scientist. Eldridge drove the Relativity through the churning currents of the timeline, pursuing the flimsiest leads, a half-glimpsed image on period media, a possible ancestor appearing in a census record. Together with his crew, he meticulously reconstructed the Hessian form of history their actions had torn asunder. It was a frustrating process. Temporal eddies shredded promising leads into dead ends, leaving only scattered pieces of a life to assemble. But Eldridge persisted, piloting them through strange confluences of warped timelines and flickering alternate realities. As steady as she goes, he told his navigator as they passed through a violent temporal storm. The forces are strong here. We cannot lose our way. Gradually, patterns began to emerge from the tangled threads. The glimpses coalesced into a rough outline of a life. Birth and death dates, ties of blood and friendship. Eldridge gazed at the timeline scans suffused with ghostly echoes of what once was, and saw hope glimmering faintly. It's still fragmented, but the essence is here, he said. We are restoring his imprint upon history. It is only a matter of time now. Morrow laid a hand on his shoulder. You were right not to lose hope. Focus and patience is paying off. Eldridge allowed himself a grim smile. The hard part is yet to come, old friend. But thanks to you all, we now have a fighting chance to set things right. The Relativity sailed on through the swirling currents of time, her crew united in purpose. Eldridge sat in the captain's chair, staring ahead with hard-won hope. The tangled web still engulfed them, but its threads were unraveling, one gossamer strand at a time. The Relativity drifted through the temporal ether, her crew vigilantly scanning the rushing strands of history flashing by. It had been 3 weeks since they embarked on their mission to reconstruct the lost timeline of Dr. Bertron, the pivotal plague researcher. Progress was steady but painfully slow. The obliteration of Bertron's life from the space-time continuum had splintered his existence across fractured shards of reality. Eldridge deftly piloted the ship through the turbulent chrono stream, expertly maneuvering to capture faint echoes as they manifested. Each fragmentary glimpse was precious empirical proof, to be logged and meticulously reassembled into a patchwork whole. But Eldridge knew the further they delved into the ruptured time stream, the stranger the waters would become. The Relativity was approaching the epicenter now, the point of disastrous first contact where their mistake had origined. Here, the laws of cause and effect broke down, giving rise to paradoxes and phantasms. "Captain!" The navigator's startled shout broke Eldridge from his reflections. "Sensors are going haywire. We're heading into some kind of temporal shear zone." On the view screen, the fluid chronotronic waves began to roil and churn. The ship listed violently as cascading temporal distortions buffeted her hull. Eldridge gripped his chair, eyes narrowed. "Steady as she goes, Helm. Nice and slow." The ship stabilized as they entered an iridescent haze, reality seeming to warp and shimmer around them. Readings flickered erratically. "It's a severe reality distortion field," Morrow reported. "We've entered a zone of temporal fragmentation." Squinting, Eldridge could just make out flickering silhouettes in the prismatic mist, ghostly echoes of people and places. There one moment and gone the next. "It's a nexus of temporal echoes," he murmured. "Remnants of possibilities left unrealized." The shadows seemed to call out soundlessly through the ages, begging to be made substantive. Eldridge steeled himself against their siren song. To alter anything now might undo all progress made. "Maintain present course and speed," he said quietly. "We cannot interfere." For 3 days the Relativity sailed through the sea of echoes, her crew silently logging hundreds of realm shards, necessary pieces to solve the puzzle of Bertron's life. At times, Eldridge spotted familiar faces in the mix. Himself, Morrow, Bertrand. Once, he glimpsed a shadow form of Earth consumed by apocalyptic fires. A dark future averted. At long last they passed into calm continuum waters. Eldridge gazed at the spectral mosaic amassed, paradoxical shards of a life lost. Within this tapestry of tangled threads, he must discern the underlying pattern. But he took heart. Never had they harvested so rich a trove of temporal data. "You did well," he told the exhausted crew. "Now we begin work on translating these dead echoes back into living history. The way ahead remains unclear, but we have found our path. By these fragments shall Bertron be restored, and the future set right." Though tired, Eldridge's eyes shone with rekindled purpose. In the luminous threads before him lay hope and redemption. The specters of time had shown the way. The Relativity glided through calm space-time, her temporal sails trimmed to catch faint, cross-chronological breezes as the crew studied their harvested shards of data. Each fragment held a whisper of the lost scientist, a ghostly resonance of a life once lived. In his quarters, Eldridge sat alone, reflecting on their progress. It was slow but steady, each extracted echo bringing them closer to restoring Bertrand and saving mankind's future. Yet doubts plagued Eldridge. Had he acted rightly in mandating this near-impossible quest? What gave him the wisdom to reshape history itself? His decisions had already ended in disaster once before. With a retrospective gaze, he revisited his original timeline intervention, scrutinizing the fateful moments, the terrible risks he had taken, driven by desperation, his willingness to end one life to save billions. Had he become blinded by the magnitude of the crisis? Allowed urgency to eclipse morality? Eldridge buried his face in his hands. The echoes of his callous actions reverberated through him, offering insight into his failings. He had succumbed to hubris, believing the future mankind's to command, but time's inexorable forces cared nothing for human hopes and fears. An alert shook Eldridge from his reflections. It was Morrow, summoning him to the bridge. More remnants had been found. Eldridge composed himself and followed, hiding his doubts behind a mask of confidence. Before the view screen, he surveyed their prizes. Video fragments, Idaho records, a diploma. Ghostly traces gradually amassing into a coherent whole. "We've collected enough data to pinpoint his location in the months preceding the outbreak," Morrow said. "If we move quickly, we may be able to make contact before the original intervention point." Eldridge nodded, even as hesitation gripped him. Were they following the right course, or only weaving a new web of temporal chaos? As if sensing his reservations, Morrow spoke. "The risks are immense, but so too are the stakes. We always knew this task would test our limits, but your leadership has brought us farther than I dreamed possible." He placed a hand on Eldridge's shoulder. "Have faith in yourself, as I and the crew do." Eldridge was silent a moment, then straightened with renewed resolve. Morrow was right. Doubt served no purpose now. All they could do was move forward and meet each challenge with wisdom, patience, and courage. "Set a course," he told the helmsman. "It's time we pay the good doctor a visit." The Relativity leaped into the quantum slipstream on jets of gleaming chronotrons. Eldridge stood firm at her helm, doubts calmed. Come what may, in the turbulent waters ahead, they would face it together, and guide time's unfolding course by the light of conscience. The mistakes of his past had revealed his most crucial failing, the belief he could bend destiny to his will. Now, wisdom had shown him a better way. By understanding time's echoes, not mastering them, might the future yet be saved. The Relativity emerged from the quantum slipstream on the outskirts of 21st century Earth. Through the viewport, the planet hung as a luminous sapphire against the velvet darkness of space. No outward signs yet marred its tranquil beauty. But Eldridge knew calamity loomed. "Bring us into standard orbit," he ordered, settling into the command chair. "Begin long-range scans. Let's get the lay of the land." Hours passed, as the crew meticulously analyzed data. Eldridge reviewed the results, searching for clues to the pivotal scientist's whereabouts. But the more they probed, the more anomalies appeared. Subtle distortions indicating escalating chronotronic instability. "Evidence suggests rising turbulence in the local time-space," Morrow said, frowning. "Pockets of altered causality are manifesting across Earth's history." Eldridge's face darkened. "Just as I feared. Our actions have created a weakness in the temporal fabric. We must find and restore the scientist's timeline before it unravels entirely." But as the Relativity sailed through high orbit, the anomalies proliferated. Violent eddies in the time stream buffeted the ship. On Earth below, the crew witnessed frightening omens, flickering rifts opening on the planet's surface, temporal echoes bleeding through. "At this rate, we may see total continuum collapse here within days," Morrow warned. Eldridge gripped his chair arms, jaw tight. Their mistake had unleashed forces threatening not just the scientist's existence, but all of Earth history. Once again, his arrogance had brought them to the brink. Suddenly, the deck lurched as a massive shockwave hit. Alarms blared. On the view screen, a gaping fissure had opened in the timescape near Earth. From its depths, Eldridge glimpsed titanic, amorphous shapes writhing in the vortex. "It's a Type 4 temporal rift," Morrow shouted. "Multiple timeline fractures. Causality breakdown across whole centuries. Whatever we've awakened, it's acting aggressively to destabilize the local space-time continuum." Eldridge's chest clenched. This malevolent entity sought not merely Earth's ruin, but the annihilation of its historic timeline. They faced no mere cosmic mishap now, but an awakened menace intent on remaking this quadrant's past and future in its own warped image. "Redline the engines. Get us away from the Earth," Eldridge barked. "We can't help if we're trapped here when the wavefront hits." The Relativity banked hard, struggling against violent gravitic shears. Eldridge watched helplessly as the rift widened, its monstrous denizens spilling forth. He had battled desperate odds before, but to defeat this foe seemed beyond hope. Yet surrender was unthinkable. Innocence across all Earth history lay in jeopardy. Once more he must challenge fate and chance temporal obliteration for any possibility of victory, no matter the cost to himself or the future's judgment of his actions. Jaw clenched, Eldridge turned from the nightmarish vista. "Now we fight," he told his crew, "for Earth and for time itself." The Relativity plunged into the fray, her captain's steely resolve carrying her into the abyss. Eldridge faced his greatest test yet, with humanity's past, present, and future at stake. The Relativity dove into the seething temporal rupture, struggling to outrun the spreading wavefront of chronometric distortion. Inside the bridge, alarms blared as the ship shuddered under the assault. "Quantum torsion levels rising," Morrow shouted over the din. "If we don't break free soon, our molecular integrity will be compromised." Jaw clenched, Eldridge held his ground in the center of the maelstrom. Just a little longer, full power to the shields. He would not retreat while Earth remained in jeopardy. As the Relativity fought against the tide, Eldridge's mind raced. There had to be a way to undo this disaster before the malevolent forces consumed all. But each desperate plan that came to mind only risked making matters worse. "Wait. Set course for Berthium 337 Mark 9, he ordered abruptly. Perhaps within the deepest crevices of space-time itself lay the key. The Relativity wheeled about and dove, plunging below the temporal surface into a lightless realm more ancient than the stars. Only neutrino flickers illuminated their passage as infinite mass pressed in around them. "We're nearing the quantum substrate, Captain," Morrow warned, his voice strained. "At these depths, causal uncertainty approaches 100%. We risk unraveling our own timeline." Eldridge's fingers dug into his armrests. "A risk we must take. There are answers here, I know it. We only have to find them." And then, ghostly shapes began to manifest in the void. Snippets of divergent realities, lives half-lived, destinies abandoned. Eldridge spotted phantom versions of himself, ships both familiar and strange. Timelines that might have been, if only he had chosen differently. "It's temporal recursion," he breathed. Across the myriad branching paths, was there one where he had avoided this fateful juncture, one where wisdom, not desperation, had guided his hand? But peering too closely risked dissociation, scattering his consciousness across probability waves. "Maintain heading," he said finally. "We are close now." Soon Eldridge began noticing a pattern. Certain events recurred in translucent echoes. A research ship, a pivotal discovery, and a scientist whose work became inexorably entwined with Eldridge's choices. Comprehension stirred. "It's him, Dr. Bertrand," Eldridge exclaimed. "We were fated to cross paths. Our histories are bound." Though the stage was different, the actors the same, each iteration illuminating new facets of their intertwined destinies. At last the Relativity emerged from the endless sea of shadows and slipped back up to the shallower strata of space-time. Eldridge turned to Morrow, eyes shining. "Set course for the 21st century, Doctor. It's time we meet this man in person." The doorway they sought had been before them all along. By understanding time's endless variations, perhaps Eldridge could yet avoid the tragic outcome of his previous interventions. This time, insight would guide his hand, and the future's tapestry weave itself anew. The Relativity emerged from temporal warp on the outer fringes of the 21st century. Through the viewport, Earth once again hung as a jewel against night's velvet void. But now, Eldridge beheld it with new eyes. This was no mere planet, but an epicenter of converging destinies. "Begin long-range scans," he ordered. "Let's confirm the timeline coordinates." Dr. Bertron was down there somewhere, Eldridge knew, his life threading through the weave of history. They would find him and restore the tapestry fate had intended. However, the chronospatial readings soon showed more turbulence than expected. "Massive gravitational shears near Earth, Captain," reported the navigator. "The temporal waveform is still in flux. Multiple alternate histories are trying to manifest." Eldridge nodded grimly. The malevolent entity they had awakened was still battling to dominate the timeline. "Get us into a stable orbital path. We'll have to navigate carefully between the probability eddies until we can localize Bertron." No sooner had the Relativity slipped into high orbit than a violent shockwave buffeted the ship. "Chronometric distortion wavefront approaching," Morrow shouted over the blaring alarms. "Brace for impact." The ship shuddered under the assault, her hull screaming in protest. Eldridge clung to his chair, eyes fixed on the roiling timescape below. He had known the risks. If they were to restore the scientist's life, they would first have to calm this raging temporal sea. "Reroute all non-critical power to shields and engines," he commanded, knuckles white. "We need to get closer to Earth. That's where the nexus point will be. From within the central maelstrom, perhaps he could quell the spread of competing timelines." The journey turned into a harrowing, spiraling descent. Buffeted by violent cross-chronal winds and fluctuating gravity wells, the Relativity fought her way down. All around, Eldridge saw ghostly apparitions. Ships, people, and worlds that flickered briefly into endangered existence, then faded as the malefic entity twisted the timeline further. But still he drove them onward, towards the eye of the storm, towards the Ansari point where Bertron's life force resonated, waiting to be reclaimed from chaos. Closer. Closer. "Captain, look!" Morrow's stunned shout broke Eldridge from his focus. There, swirling in the vortex below, a shimmering silhouette of the Relativity herself. He gasped in shock. They were sailing right into their own temporal wake, crossing paths with the disastrous first intervention. "It is a chrono loop, Captain," Morrow warned. "If we don't break free, we risk entrapment and temporal recursion." Eldridge hesitated only a moment. "Hold course. We're too close now. I'll power to forward shields." If his past self had caused this calamity, then he must be the one to make it right. The spectral Relativity loomed closer, a grim harbinger of their previous failures. Eldridge braced himself, prepared to weather the collision of past and present. "Come on, old girl," he whispered. At the moment of impact, reality shuddered, then stretched, like taffy pulled in opposing directions. And suddenly, Eldridge found himself looking into his own face, the shocked gaze of the man he used to be. Their eyes locked, and an understanding passed between them. Then the loop collapsed, and the other Relativity faded back into the mists of probability. The storm abated around them, as if its power had been broken. "The distortion waves are calming, Captain," Morrow reported. "I'm detecting an Ansari point in Moorer and a life sign." "It's him." Eldridge allowed himself a weary smile. By confronting his past mistakes, he had quelled the chaos they unleashed. Now, at last, the tapestry could be woven anew. "Then let's go meet the good doctor," he said, "and make sure fate gets their threads tied together." The Relativity sailed out of the maelstrom, her captain's shoulders unbowed. Ahead waited the promise of a future restored and redemption earned. The Relativity sailed through clear space-time towards 21st century Earth, her crew invigorated by a new sense of purpose. Somewhere on that azure globe ahead was Dr. Bertron, the pivotal researcher whose existence tied inexorably to humanity's fate. At last the ship slipped into high orbit. "Activate long-range bioscans," Eldridge ordered. "Let's pinpoint his location." Hours passed in tense anticipation as the computer sifted through billions of life readings. Then finally, a single ping, coordinates matching the geographic projections. "Confirmed biolock," Morrow announced. "He's still down there, Captain. The scientist lives." Eldridge allowed himself a brief smile of relief. By following fate's echoes, they had found the way. Yet, he knew this was only the first step. Restoring Bertron's life would require navigating a tangled web of converging realities. "Take us into transporter range," he ordered. "But keep the chronoton shields raised. We don't want to risk contact until we understand the local environment." As the Relativity descended, the crew began detecting chronometric turbulence surrounding the scientist's location, subtle at first, but growing. "It's as if history is trying to erase him," Morrow said, studying the readings. "His timeline is under gravitational stress from competing probability waves." Eldridge nodded grimly. "Just as I suspected, our previous actions have destabilized his existence. We'll need to reinforce its structure before extracting him. Of course, the mistakes of his past were still propagating, threatening to consume Bertron's reality. Once more, Eldridge's arrogance had placed everything in jeopardy. Cursing himself, he paced the deck, desperately seeking a solution. "There might be a way, Captain," Morrow spoke up. "We could use the chronoton field to imprint an identity anchor, a quantum lifeline to reinforce his temporal symmetry. I'd need to go down to the surface to initiate it." Eldridge hesitated, then nodded. "Make it so, Doctor, but exercise extreme caution. We're dealing with forces beyond our reckoning." He clasped Morrow's shoulder. "Good luck. Just make sure you come back in one piece. We've already altered history enough for one day." Moments later, Eldridge watched anxiously as Morrow's silhouette shimmered into nothingness on the transporter pad. Out there, stranded between shifting realities, the doctor faced grave perils, and his success or failure would determine all their fates. "Your life's in his hands now, my friend," Eldridge whispered, thinking of Bertron down on that threatened Earth. "And so is ours." He could only wait now, trusting in Morrow and Providence. If anyone could navigate the quantum maelstrom to locate the vanished scholar, it was Morrow. Each minute stretched out interminably, until finally the console chimed with an incoming signal. "Two to beam up," came Morrow's excited hail. Eldridge spun to see two figures taking shape on the pad. Morrow, and a white-coated man who could only be Dr. Bertrand. Against all probability, they had plucked this singular life from the jaws of oblivion. Eldridge went to greet the dazed scientist. Hope rekindled. Though the time stream remained turbulent, this crucial thread was now secure. "Welcome aboard, Dr. Bertron," he said warmly. "We have much to discuss about your future, and humanity's." Eldridge gazed out the viewport at the luminous orb of 21st century Earth. Somewhere down there, he knew calamity still brewed, a malevolent force seeking dominion over the planet's historic timeline. They had plucked Dr. Bertrand from the maw of non-existence, but the scientist's life remained in a state of quantum flux, his reality at the mercy of competing probability waves. To secure his rightful place in history, Eldridge realized they would need to do more than observe. Action was required. "Doctor, analyze the chronometric distortions surrounding Bertrand's native time frame," he ordered. "Look for patterns, instabilities, anything we could exploit." Morrow's eyes lit up with comprehension. A localized gravity wave could reinforce his temporal symmetry, sealing his timeline, but we'd have to calibrate it precisely across the quantum grid. Eldridge nodded. "Then let's get to work. This will take finesse. We only get one shot." For the next several hours, Eldridge and Morrow meticulously formulated their plan, calibrating sensors and simulating potential chronogravitic force models. At last, the readings alignment they needed appeared. "This could do it, Captain," Morrow exclaimed. "If we detonate a quantum torpedo here, the resulting gravity wave should reset Bertron's local space-time continuum to its original state." Eldridge allowed himself a grim smile. They would fight chronofire with chronofire. By introducing their own distortion, perhaps they could force the timescape to self-correct around Bertron's life. "Make it so, Doctor. Take us into high orbit over the target coordinates." Adrenaline flooded Eldridge's veins. Once more, onto the breach. As the Relativity slipped into position, Eldridge steeled himself and gave the order he hoped would save humanity's future. "Fire!" For an instant, as the torpedo launched, Eldridge thought he glimpsed his phantom doppelganger in the time vortex ahead, the Eldridge who had initiated this calamity. Their eyes met across the quantum gulf, and an understanding passed between them. Then the torpedo detonated. The ship shuddered violently as a massive gravity wave erupted before them, dispersing in concentric rings below. Eldridge watched the chronometric readings intently as the blast wave propagated. "Come on." Seconds stretched out, interminable, Then finally a cascade of pings and alerts. "It's working!" Morrow yelled. "The local space-time grid is resetting around Bertron's life force. His timeline symmetry is stabilizing." Eldridge sank back into his chair, the strength leaving his body. Once again they had tempted fate, and won. Bertron's destiny was again woven into history's tapestry, securing the future Eldridge sought. Yet, even as he tasted victory, Eldridge knew this was only one battle. The war to set right what had gone wrong would continue. But for now, reality's weave remained intact. Gazing down at the luminous planet below, Eldridge allowed himself a moment's satisfaction. Each distortion battled brought them one step closer, and though the road remained long, its end lay ahead, where hope waited and redemption shone bright as daybreak. The Relativity glided through high orbit, her crew taking a moment to breathe after their latest brinksmanship with space-time. But Eldridge knew any respite was fleeting. Dangerous forces still swirled in the chronoscape below. "Dr. Bertron, what can you tell us about your work prior to the outbreak?" he asked, turning to their newly rescued guest. "Your research was vital in developing the cure." Bertron removed his glasses, polishing them nervously. "I fear I won't be of much use, Captain. I'm just an epidemiologist. I was only studying infection trends before I was brought here." Eldridge shared an uneasy glance with Morrow. If Bertron's pivotal work still lay ahead in his native timeline, could they risk returning him yet? But keeping him here threatened causality. Difficult decisions lay ahead. "Captain," the navigator's shout dispelled Eldridge's ruminations. "Long-range scans show the anomaly is metastasizing." On the view screen, the swirling rents in space-time were converging, forming a massive vortex below. From its center erupted violent shock waves, resonating disruptions across the planet's timeline. "It's deteriorating into a Class 9 temporal rift," Morrow reported, fingers flying across console controls. "Unchecked, the entire region's history could be annihilated within hours." Eldridge slammed a fist down hard. Once again, his actions had invited catastrophe, and now millions more lives hung in the balance. "Redline it. Bring us into the gyre," he ordered through gritted teeth. Whatever it took, he would find a way to tame this tempest, or die trying. The Relativity plunged into the maw, a space churning violently around them. Chronometric sensors wailed, screens dissolving into static as quantum fluctuations buffeted the ship. Each moment brought them closer to flying blind molecular dissolution. Yet still Eldridge held his course, searching desperately for a way to halt the spread of chrono chaos. If only he could localize the epicenter and introduce an inverse gravitic pulse. "There," Morrow shouted over the din. Through the chaos, he had spotted the rift's origin point, a shimmering node around which the madness revolved. Eldridge wasted no time. "Target chronodynes and fire!" Incandescent beams erupted from the Relativity, lancing through the turbulence to strike the glimmering nexus dead on. For a moment, all seemed still. Then the node erupted, a billowing shockwave blasting outward, counteracting the spread of disturbances. As it passed, Eldridge watched in awe as the raging torrents began to settle. "It is working!" Morrow yelled triumphantly. Slowly, arduously, balance was restored to the frenzied gyre as causal symmetries reasserted themselves. At long last, calm perpetual waters surrounded the weary Relativity once more. Eldridge leaned back, exhaustion and relief competing within him. They had walked a razor's edge this day, and somehow prevailed. Perhaps now, the road ahead seemed smoother, but an inner voice warned him not to grow complacent. However glass-like the sea appeared, storms ever lurked beneath its surface. More trials awaited, and next time, fate might not bless them with deliverance. Pushing down his doubts, Eldridge rose to address the crew. "Well done, all of you. Thanks to your efforts, we have won a great victory." Their tired faces managed wan smiles in return. "Yet our true mission remains," Eldridge continued, "to undo the harm we have wrought upon the unsuspecting people of the past. Only then can we guide humanity's ship safe to shore." He moved closer to the viewport, gazing down at the beckoning blue marble below. Somewhere on its surface, Bertron's timeline still hung by a thread, waiting to be secured. "Back to work," Eldridge told his crew, jaw set firm. "We have a history to rewrite." The Relativity sailed on through untroubled waters, her captain inwardly steeled for the trials ahead. The cosmic sea, he knew, remained unsettled, and before their voyage ended, it was certain to rage again. The Relativity cruised through calm space-time, pursuing the meticulous work of restoring Bertron's rightful place in the time stream. Eldridge studied the latest astrometric charts and sensor readings, searching for their next opportunity to reinforce the scientist's existence along its proper track. Despite their recent victories, tension hung thick in the air. The forces that opposed them remained potent, and Eldridge knew the sea of time yet roiled with unseen dangers. But come what may, he would hold his course. Neither dragging currents nor phantom storms could deter him from this sacred quest. "Captain, I'm picking up some unusual quantum signals from Earth's late 21st century, Morrow spoke up. "There appears to be an area of severely distorted space-time circumscribing the planet during that period." Eldridge crossed to the science station, scrutinizing the strange sensor data. "Can you localize the disturbance's origin point?" "Trying now." Morrow's fingers danced across the console. Then he tapped the screen. "Here. March 12th, 2087 in Central Florida. The heart of the temporal shear zone." Eldridge's eyes widened in recognition. That's the date Bertron's critical plasma vaccine trials took place. A major milestone. He gripped Morrow's shoulder tightly. If we could ensure his uninterrupted work, it might cement his destiny permanently. But inserting themselves into such a distorted period was hugely risky. Still, Eldridge's course was clear. "Lay in a course, Helm. I'll prepare an away team for temporal insertion at the source point." Failure was not an option, not when they were so close. As the Relativity approached the shimmering gyre around late 21st century Earth, Eldridge gathered his landing party in the transporter room. Each of them knew the immense dangers they faced. Dr. Bertron stepped forward, clasping Eldridge's arm. "I'll do everything I can to ensure my alternate self completes those trials. We all have a stake in this." Eldridge nodded, grateful for his courage. "Energize." The transporter beam deposited them into a nightmare realm of radical causality breakdowns and quantum superpositions. Eldridge tapped his chronometric stabilizer, ensuring he remained anchored in the present. Around him, ghostly people and buildings continuously flickered into and out of existence, echoing shifts in probabilities. Eldridge pushed down his unease. Bertron's lab should be 2 kilometers east. Let's move. Navigating the space-time shear zone was exhausting. With every step, Eldridge needed to focus intensely to filter out temporal noise and anchor himself in the nadir of the present moment. Strange scenes and figures surrounded him, threatening to unmoor his consciousness. But Eldridge pressed on, calling on every ounce of will and training. He had journeyed too far to falter now. Each small step took enormous effort as the possible consumed the actual. Finally, Bertron's lab emerged through the fog of bifurcating realities. Eldridge's team entered to find the scientist's alternate self on the floor, weakly trying to gather up scattered papers and vials. Around him, the room kept subtly shifting. "It's no use," the prone man gasped. "My research, the vaccine trial, somehow it all went wrong. I've lost control of the causal sequence." The elder Bertron helped his alternate self up. "Listen to me. Your work is critical. You must complete the trial no matter the difficulty. All our fates depend on it." Eldridge and his team joined in stabilizing the lab's chronotons, just long enough for the trial to resume. After agonizing hours, the alternate, Bertron, finally announced success. The new vaccine worked. The timeline was secured. Returning to the Relativity, Eldridge sagged with exhaustion. He had faced death many times before, but never such peril to his very sense of reality. Yet once again, miraculously, he had walked the razor's edge between past and future, and emerged intact. Now only the final steps of their journey remained. His quest's end lay ahead, as did redemption, if he could but keep faith. Through all opposition, Eldridge refused to yield. The impossible was merely the untried. Essayez croire. The Relativity soared triumphantly away from the late 21st century, her crew invigorated by the success of their latest chronological intervention. Within that turbulent period, they had secured Dr. Bertron's pivotal contributions, perhaps the key domino that would cascade into his restored existence across time. Eldridge allowed himself a moment of satisfaction as he reviewed the updated astrometric charts. The scientist's life force now shone clearly amidst the quantum foam, his timeline symmetry realigned to its proper structure. It appears our actions have caused a major realignment to the local space-time continuum, Morrow reported, consulting the sensor feeds. Bertron's causal imprint is propagating through the chronostream once more. Eldridge nodded, finally daring to hope they had tipped the balance. Set course for 2422. It's time we verified the fruits of our labor back home. As the Relativity neared the 25th century, signs of transformation became apparent. Anomalous readings diminished, the ominous fissures in space-time sealing as if they had never been, and ahead, on long-range scanners, Earth, whole and vibrant with life force. We're detecting active population centers across the globe, came the astonished report. Captain, the plague devastation has been undone. Eldridge stared at the precious image of Earth restored on the view screen. After so long bearing the weight of humanity's near destruction, disbelief and relief cascaded through him. Stand by to enter standard orbit, he ordered, struggling to keep his voice steady. Let's get a confirmation on Bertron's status. Moments later, the answer flashed up on monitors across the Relativity's bridge. Records of the scientist's life, birth, childhood, education, career, all were present. The crew broke into applause, Morrow pumping Eldridge's hand vigorously. Against impossible odds, they had resurrected not only a man, but the future itself. Eldridge walked to the viewport and placed a trembling palm on the smooth glass. Somewhere down there, people lived and loved, saved by a miracle they would never know to thank him for. But even amidst the jubilation, an undercurrent of unease lurked within Eldridge's mind. Had they truly set history right, or merely forestalled disaster? The malevolent entity yet lurked in the depths of space-time, and he knew its ire would not easily be quelled. For now, though, life flourished once more on Earth. The planet of his birth no longer faced oblivion in his lifetime, and Eldridge had redeemed himself in the sight of generations yet unborn. The shifting winds of time had blown mercy's way at last. Yet ahead, Eldridge sensed the final battle still awaited. When reality rose up to meet their audacious bid to reshape eternity's weave, on that day, either destiny itself would bend, or he. The Relativity glided in high orbit above a restored 25th century Earth, her crew allowing themselves a breath of relief. Against all odds, their quest to resurrect Dr. Bertron appeared successful. The timeline mutations had been healed, the good doctor's life and work, once again woven into history's tapestry. Yet Eldridge knew this lull could prove illusory. Though diminished, dangerous chronometric distortions still simmered below. threatening to resurge if the primordial entity's malevolence was not quelled. "Scan for residual shear zones surrounding Earth, Morrow," Eldridge ordered, a crease of worry on his brow. "That thing is wounded, not dead. It could lash out again at any moment." Sure enough, the sensor sweep soon detected violent spikes in quantum fluctuation levels, signaling the beast was stirring. Rents began opening in the timescape, spewing chronoton's particles. "It's breaking loose," Morrow warned. "At this rate, we'll see total temporal anarchy within hours." Eldridge's jaw tightened, resolve hardening to steel. After everything, he would not relent while humanity's history hung in jeopardy. "Bring us about. We end this threat here and now." He commanded full power to weapons and engines as the Relativity dove into the maelstrom once more. Around them, chaotic forces threatened to tear Earth's timeline asunder and unmake billions of lives and stories. But Eldridge held firm, guiding them unerringly through the widening gyre. As long as he drew breath, the Relativity would stand firm against the encroaching darkness. This day, either eternity or oblivion awaited, and Eldridge would see the former won. At the cyclone's core, the anomaly's epicenter pulsed malevolently, a cancerous singularity seeking to corrupt all creation with its chaotic imprint. Eldridge's eyes narrowed as he beheld the source of Earth's torment. "Target quantum warheads. Fire!" Blazing chronometric energy erupted in concentric rings from the Relativity, striking the singularity dead on. For a moment, all seemed still. Then the maw imploded with a silent flash, the shockwave resonating outward. Eldridge shielded his eyes against the brilliant light as Earth's timeline reasserted its proper structure amidst the receding chaos. When he lowered his hand, calm stars greeted his sight once more. Where the devouring singularity had been, now only orderly space-time remained. "It's over," Morrow breathed, staring at the readings in wonder. "The distortion levels are fading across all centuries. The timeline is whole." A cheer went up across the bridge as the crew hugged one another in joy and relief. But Eldridge stood silent, closed his eyes, and offered up a small prayer of thanks. Once more, somehow, they had walked destiny's crumbling edge and prevailed. The Relativity turned for home, her long voyage nearing its end. One final stop remained to close the circle Eldridge had opened. Down on 21st century Earth, a mistake waited to be erased, and a redemption to be claimed. The Relativity slipped into low orbit above 21st century Earth, her space-time engines humming with anticipation. Below on the azure globe awaited the final steps of Eldridge's redemptive journey, erasing the grievous mistake that began this odyssey and securing the future of humankind. "Initiate chronometric scanning," Eldridge ordered tersely. "Let's confirm the original intervention point coordinates." He had replayed the fateful moments endlessly in his mind. Now it was time to rewrite them. The bridge crew worked swiftly, energized by being on the cusp of their long quest's end. Then the navigator spoke. "Lock acquired, Captain. The breakpoint traces back to a public park in northeastern Virginia. Current date, April 4th, 2045. Eldridge allowed himself a thin smile. At last, the mistakes of his past could be undone. "Take us into transporter range and activate stealth systems. We cannot risk being spotted." Surprise would be their ally this day. As the Relativity swooped silently over the unsuspecting park, Eldridge gathered the landing team in the transporter room. Dr. Bertron met his gaze and nodded, face set with resolve. Like Eldridge, he knew what was at stake this day. "You have your assignments and coordinates," Eldridge told them, pride warming his voice. "Today we finish what was started so long ago, and secure the future for generations to come." Eldridge stepped onto the transporter pad, the beam energizing around him. "For Earth," he said, then vanished in a shimmer of light. The team materialized amidst the gentle susurrus of leaves, a light breeze tousling their hair. Eldridge tapped his wrist scanner, overlaying a ghostly waypoint on the sunny tableau before them. There waited his past self, poised to ignite calamity. Silently they fanned out, surrounding the cytochrome and phasers drawn. At Eldridge's signal they would strike, preventing the disastrous intervention. Victory lay within their grasp, but still his heart pounded, sweat beading his brow. Then he spotted it, the telltale shimmer in reality that presaged the opening of the rift. It was time. He raised his hand, ready to issue the order, when suddenly his past self whirled, reacting to some instinctive warning of what was to come. For a split second, their eyes locked across the years, and in that moment, Eldridge glimpsed himself through the lens of time. He saw the heavy toll weighing down his other self's shoulders, the haggard weariness in his face, and beneath it all, the razored edge of desperation fueled by the burden of worlds. A desperate man trying to carry the weight of civilization's survival alone. Eldridge wavered, hand lowering. Could he condemn this man for wanting to protect untold billions, whatever the cost? For following his conscience into dangerous waters, rather than do nothing? As his past self turned back, readying to fire, Eldridge knew he could not. What mattered was not the mistakes made, but the determination to right them. And that nobility still lay inside the soul of the man before him. Silently, he signaled the team to stand down. This chapter would end differently, by walking forward, not erasing the past. His other self had taken the first step of their shared journey. Now Eldridge would take the next. He tapped his communicator, returning to the relativity in a halo of light. The timeline churned around them, eager for its new course. "Set a heading for home," Eldridge told the expectant bridge crew. "Our work here is done." As Earth faded from view, he gazed back at its blue marble with fondness. His history there would always remain ambiguous, but the future was crystalline, filled with hope and redemption. He had woven sorrow. Now he would reap joy. The tale that began in uncertainty had led to resurgence.
Thank you very much for listening. Please leave a like if you enjoyed this story. Subscribe if you loved it.